I am so excited about talking with you, Dr. Shanita Brown. I've been doing a series all month, just having mental health conversations and bringing awareness to it. I am not a counselor, but I have been a product of counseling. I've recently published my book, which is Forgotten Living in Shadows of Domestic Violence. And mental health and counseling was really what helped me address those traumas and get over a lot of that stuff that I dealt with growing up, because it started bleeding into my adulthood years. So I wanted to drive as much awareness as possible. And then I came across, social media is powerful when done the right way. I came across your blog, Dr. Brown, about spiritual abuse in the Clark sisters. And I was watching this movie, and in the first intro, when I saw like the abuse happening, and as I continued to watch the dynamics, I was able to see myself in the story. And for those who are not aware of my story, you may wonder, like, how did you see yourself in the story? Well, I grew up as in a domestic violence home, and my father is a preacher. And a lot of what happened in that movie, I felt was a result in their reactions and their relationships they got into later. There were different cues, but as I'm like, I can relate to that. I didn't see like everyone else takeaways. You know how you kind of scrolling and you're looking for people's feedback on, hey, like, did everyone else see what I just saw? No one else commented on it. And I saw your blog and I was like, yes, this was everything that I was thinking. And I'd been following you prior to that anyway, but when you had that article, and it was like, yes, no one talks about the spiritual abuse. And in your blog, I'm going to pull up real quick as we talked about it. You had like, you point out what spiritual abuse is, and you point out like those factors in the movie. But then you talk about how Black women make up more than 70% of active congregations in Black churches. And we play a role in the survival of Black churches. And I was like, yes. On so many levels. Now, for those of you who may not know who Dr. Brown is, she is amazing. Let me tell you, she has over 15 years experience in mental health, part of North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence, has done numerous speaking engagements. She goes to equip and educate different organizations and faith communities on domestic violence and in the clinical mental health field. So I am going to let you, I kind of just talked a little bit there, but I'm going to let you fill in wherever I may left, because I've been just so excited that you even said yes, and that we're having this much needed conversation, because I have not seen the conversations out there about this.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Tiffany, for having me. It's definitely an honor and a privilege to be able to talk about domestic violence in the faith community. Is something near and dear to my heart, and I appreciate your courage in sharing that you went to counseling and how that benefit you. You are definitely impacting lives and modeling what counseling can do for people who take that first step. You know, it is a first step, it is a process, but willing to do the work. And so thank you for sharing, because when you share, you empower and encourage someone else. So this thing with spiritual abuse, right? It goes back to looking at the Clark sisters, but as you were saying a little bit about my intro, I've been in this field for almost 20 years now, working in various settings, and working with children, adolescents, and even this started from my dissertation and my research. And so I looked at the intersection of race and spirituality, and the role of the Black church and how they intersect for Black women, looking at how they narrate their stories, looking at how they perceive spirituality and the role of leaving that abusive relationship. Why? Because Black women, you know, we experience domestic violence more than any other ethnicity. And so we have to look at why this is an epidemic for Black women. And then we look at that, and then the role of oppression, and then the role of faith. You know, so if we take that into context, we're looking at why more Black women are experiencing. There's some historical context to that, but also looking at the faith part. And so after interviewing 8 women and looking at their experiences, I would say that I was just taken back. Some of them were PK kids, also known as preacher kids. They witnessed domestic violence. They were told to stay in relationships. So spirituality serves not only as a positive coping strategy, right? We know historically, we in the Black community, we turn to faith, prayer and faith for everything. That's our go-to first. Before they come into a counselor, before they see me, they're like, Dr. Brown, well, I've gone to my church first, and then I'm going to see a counselor. And so we have to recognize when working and serving Black victims or survivors that the role of spirituality and faith is paramount to their identity. And so what I found was that they were told to stay in the relationships. They were told that they had to submit. So spirituality served as a barrier. And this is the thing that we do not talk about. Yeah, we know prayer and faith is our go-to. That's what we do. But also in this spiritual abuse that we're not talking about, it is happening. It is time to take a stand against this and really create sanctuaries of healing for Black women who make up over 7% of the church who are suffering. So it is really important to really talk about. And when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, this is on my research. But I've seen movies like, Tina Turner, who experienced domestic violence. But for me, a woman of faith as a Christian, and seeing how this iconic female Black group that changed the landscape for women in gospel music, and how she endured this domestic violence, this spiritual abuse specifically, right? There were several power and control dynamics in this movie. So it was when she experienced it, then Twinkie experienced it, what we saw, what they shared. And I appreciate the Clark sisters and the writers for really taking us there as Black women of faith, Black women faith leaders. She was a faith leader. She had, directed a ministry, but also the abuse from the church, how she was treated. And then also the last power dynamic was when she also utilized the scriptures and text out of context to manipulate her children to do what she wanted to do. And so I felt that it was really important to talk about spiritual abuse. And out of that, here we are, and women are saying, I now have a name for this. I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I needed to stay in this. I thought that if I divorced, God, that he hated me because of what the bishop said, or what because the faith leader said, or what because the deacon said, or what because the first lady said, and not realize that things were taken out of context to keep people in these very oppressive relationships.
Yeah, you hit on so many great points. And being a child growing up in that, a lot of all those statements that you said, I heard in my household. It was also very terrifying because my parents were married for 30 years. And my father was a preacher for a majority of that. So the first time I saw the abuse, I was 7 years old. And it continued until I was 17 when my mom finally said, I can't do this anymore. And through those years, I saw the battles. So I remember my mom going to other preachers for help to seek accountability. Like, can you hold my husband accountable? Like, this is what's happening. And she was sent back, go back. And that, the first time I saw the abuse, that was why she was beat down as bad as she was because she went to another preacher and told what happened in that house. And let alone another man is not going to check another man. So any other like feedback from there, be a good wife, submit. She would talk to other preachers' wives. Hey, I never grew up in this. How do I navigate this? God hates divorce. You're being tested. You have to be a good measure of faith. And so as a kid, when you're watching this, not even to mention the in-church dynamics, right? So he never acted out in church, but as the preacher, as the pastor, I remember we had to watch him the whole service. You couldn't look left, couldn't look right. If you had to greet a neighbor, hurry up and do it quick. But he watched you the whole entire service. You could not just mix and like there was so much power and control there, like you said. And you just think about we're in 2020 now. This was the early 90s. That was like 94, 95-ish. And we are still in a place for some of that. So since I've released my book, I get so much feedback that I was in a marriage. I'm in a marriage. I went to the church leaders. and this is what they're telling me, and or the church doesn't talk about it, or they brush it aside, and they seek to get the offender more help. So it's, how do we in 2020 equip our faith leaders and faith communities to embrace? Like, we're not telling you that you have to learn every component of and be equipped, but at least connect with resources, or at least know what it looks like so you can spot it, because abusers are hiding and offenders are hiding in the churches, and they're going home and they're misconstruing the Bible, especially as a kid growing up. Like, I'm hearing Bible texts being thrown at me. So I feared God, not in a reverence, but I feared God in a, God is punishing mom, so we're doing something wrong as a family. So now my view of God is that, like, this is the type of God who God is, because this is what my father is modeling, and he must be right because he's preaching thus saith the Lord every Sunday, regardless that he beat mama, you know.
Right.
So it hits not just to even the victims and survivors, but it also puts a new model to children. So how do we help our faith leaders embrace this conversation, not from an accusatory, like, this is just facts, but to equip?
Yeah, so Tiffany, you said so much there. So what you were speaking about of this pattern in witnessing, right? And so what we're talking about, and I want people to understand that the first image of a relationship starts at home. That becomes your relational template. What kids see, they model. And even for abusers, they see this behavior. They're some of this is learned, right? And then we have the culture messages. We have this thing of entitlement and ownership, and then they really feel entitled that I need to maintain power and control over you. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. But it's also a choice, because there are people who witnessed it and who are not choosing to engage in that behavior. So I want that to be clear. It is not an anger management issue as well. No, domestic violence, all these forms of abuse, it's not anger management. So it's when this power and control. So when you watch that becomes your template until, like you say, you do that work. And then again, because the power of the brain and neuroplasticity, we can really rewire our images through healthy connections. What you're talking about, when you had that healthy relationship with your counselor, you were able to kind of switch and work through your trauma and have this healthy, have healthy relationships and healthy connections. It is possible. Now, you mentioned that, going to the church, right? This came up again in my research, the silence of the pastors. The silence of pastors and bishops and faith leaders continuously is perpetuating abuse. So the first thing we have to do, we have to talk about it. Because when we're not talking about it, you're sending the message that it's okay. I don't think, and I don't fully believe, I do not believe that faith leaders have this intent. They don't know, they're not trained. They don't cover domestic violence in divinity school, right? That's the first thing, right? So you have to look at what are they training. And so, this part of my ministry and what I do is train churches. I train leaders on domestic violence awareness. I train churches on how to set up a ministry. I've had to do that in my home church. But at the core of it is the education piece. Like you said, these are facts. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence right in your church pew. They are suffering in silence. So when you have a huge platform and you are charged with being the spiritual leader and the spiritual leader in the care of your congregation, at the very least, that you want to cover the safety and well-being of your parishioners. And that is addressing domestic violence. That's the first step. You have to talk about it. You really have to talk about it. When you talk about it, you're letting people know, my pastor is understanding, somehow gets it, let me know that maybe this may be a place that I can go. But you also mentioned that I have heard in my clients that I want the church to hold him accountable, right? And so sometimes women, and I work with more women survivors than I do male, but I have worked with male survivors of domestic violence and various forms of abuse because, you know, nobody's exempt, no gender is expense. But in the speaking of a woman, when I was working with her, I said, what do you want the church to do? I want them to hold him accountable. I want them to pull him to the side. I want them to tell him, you need to stop beating your wife. And so we began to talk about this and plan and kind of like, so what have you heard your pastor say? Oh, Dr. Brown, that's a good point. I never really heard him say anything about it. Because we have to be careful when we think, okay, I want the church to hold him accountable, right? What is your pastor? If your pastor isn't saying anything, maybe we broach this conversation in passing. You know, what do you think about this? It's always on the news, right? It's domestic violence is always in the news. What do you think about this person that experienced it? Kind of broach and see what's happening, right? And see what they say. Listen to what they're saying. If you hear things like, oh, she was asking for it. No. Oh, she wanted it. She could have just left him. She didn't have to do that. She has kids, for crying out sake. Why did she say it? Okay. So these are signals and indicators that perhaps your faith leader is not the best person to go to talk about this abuse. Because what will happen, most likely what ends up happening, you prepare to be re-victimized. Questions such as, well, what were you doing? So, you know, I got to hear his side of the story. So God hates divorce, all these cliches. And then that person is re-victimized because they wanted to go to their faith leader first. This love and connection, this dear heart woman connection that we have with our faith leader, especially if you've been in a church for a long period of time, you're going to go to them. So it is so important for faith leaders to recognize the power that they have and the position that they hold in looking at the well-being from a holistic approach to well-being of the parishioners. But also the spiritual abuse is also not only when one intimate partner maintains and uses religious and scriptural texts, but it's also when faith leaders abuse their power as well and create this toxic culture of controlling their members. So it's two parts of the spiritual abuse. You have it where the partner say, you can't worship today. You have to stay home with me. Or like you were saying, the God hates divorce, or the cliches, or your children have to grow up practicing this particular religion because I said so. There are various forms, but it's also when faith leaders are abusing their power and creating this toxic culture and controlling and manipulating their members. So I wanted to point that out as well, because you do see that. So it is important when you think about who you're going to go to, kind of have a trusted friend to talk to. What are you looking for your faith leader to do?
Yeah.
Because you, just as you said, you know, hold them accountable. If they don't have the training and education, if they don't speak to it, then it's likely that what you're looking for may not happen. Yeah. Right? It may not happen. So the education piece is important. Then coming in and training your clergy. Yeah. That is important, but also some self-reflection too. What are your views about this domestic violence and sexual abuse? This violence against women and children. How do you feel about it? You know, kind of looking at your own experiences. Did you experience violence growing up, right? Because everybody has a story. So a lot of times, you know, when I tell people that, be expected to have some sort of pushback, because there is pushback sometimes. I'm not really sure about that. This is not our problem, right? But at the very least, when coming in and understanding, if you're going to do this work, first get the proper training. Connecting your people who come to you to professional advocates who do the work. If you're not trained to do the work, then you can't do the work. This is not a couples or marriage issue, right? Because what happens when you bring two people together, which unethically, I don't work with couples where there's domestic violence. You can't do that, right? Because of the safety measures, and that person's going to go right back home, and they're probably most likely going to get abused again for what was said in front of the pastor. So understanding that this is not a situation where this is your typical couples counseling when abuse is in play. This isn't it. So really connecting with your agencies, connecting with your advocates, training your clergy. You're getting the training. Make this routine, and also creating policy as well. You know, like really, what policies do you have in place when your faith leader, your deacon, or your minister is the abuser? How do you hold them accountable? Those are some things that I can go more and more. No, that's a separate training that I have engaged in.
Yeah.
We're going to talk more about that. But really, like, you have to hold the abusers accountable. It isn't just something that you just and abuse is when the abuser needs some sort of battery intervention program or going through the training to understanding their pattern of behavior. You know, I have had people say, well, they're going to go to anger management class. And I've had, you know, I don't think it's abuse. You know, why you got to call it that word? You know, I didn't make up the word, you know, but what's happening is this pattern of controlling behavior. When you point it out, this is a form of domestic violence. This is a form of power and control. This is what it calls. So are you ready to do the work to change your behavior?
Yeah.
Like, get into the core of it. And a lot of times that take faith leaders looking at themselves.
Yeah, that's good. And it's not just a social issue. It's a gospel issue.
Yeah.
It's a gospel issue as well, because you look at the foundation of Christ's ministry. He came for those who were in situations like this. We are to be God's agents in the feet and the mouth to free and help provide safety to his people and healing. So you also touched on another component, because I received questions before we went live. I started receiving messages. And one of the questions that came when you talked about the other layer of spiritual abuse is leaders that do it to even their members. And the question that came is, there's things that are said like, don't touch God's anointed, as a free pass to not being able to hold pastors that are defiling God's anointed, his people. How do you hold accountable? And in some instances, like we say in corporate America, you manage up. Like, how do you manage up? How do you in the church call that out without being deemed rebellious or disrespectful because you're not following those protocols?
So this is a great question. And so this is where you begin to look at the infrastructure of the church. Look at what policies do they have in place when your pastor is abusing his power. What leeway, what rights do congregations have? Who do we report to? Who do we tell that we are experiencing this? Because this is another form of what you're talking about, these cliches, right? Don't touch that anointing. But it's wrong. I'm not a theologian, but I do know what's in the Bible. You know, calling it out is wrong. We have to call the abuse out. And when I have trained faith leaders, I have had faith leaders say, Dr. Brown, other ministers will ridicule me if I tell someone to leave an abusive relationship. I said, so tell me more what's happening there. They would say, you can't do that. You know, we're charged with keeping people together. So I said to him, where in the Bible does it say that abuse is okay? So on one hand, this is where the education component comes in. Because faith leaders, we have this institution of marriage. I believe in marriage. I believe wholeheartedly. But he's talking about equality, love, right? Equality, respect. If that isn't in there, then how can you morally, rightfully so, tell someone to stay in a relationship when you know they're getting physically, emotionally, sexually abused? I don't even see how that sits okay with a faith leader. They're picking and choosing the scripture for the sake of, I am keeping this marriage together. There's something wrong with that. To me, that's what I see. That's an example of bad theology, right? That's an example of bad theology when they're picking and choosing the institution of marriage and trying to keep people. When in actuality, you rightfully so, as you say, morally, let's look at, how do I keep them safe? How does the marriage, the institution of marriage, becomes more important than the well-being and safety of some people? How does that happen? So I think that when a faith leader said it to me, I was really appalled. This is my first time doing the training after I finished my Ph.D. program. He said, you'd be surprised the number of pastors and ministers who say to me, I can't believe you told her to leave. he said, well, what was I supposed to do if she said he almost killed her?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, ooh, that's a lot.
That's a lot. You know, faith leaders are in tough positions, you know. And so it takes a leader that's bold and understands the word and understands, you know, how am I looking after my flock? How am I touching all areas? You know, you have awareness for breast cancer, you have all these Red Heart Awareness Sundays, and you know, now you're seeing more mental health. But you we're getting to the conversation of domestic violence. But we still have work to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so there are things that we could do when you begin to talk about it and normalize it for people. People begin to come out and they begin to want help, and you have to be prepared to help your people, just as you would somebody coming in as homeless. Why historically the church is where Black people go for everything: food, financial resources, educational support. Dating back to the city, I mean, the church was the epicenter of the Black community. So how are you going to touch on certain things and not touch on domestic violence that's plaguing Black women, killing Black women every day? How can you not touch on that? That's the question I have for faith. How can you not address it?
Yeah.
It's one thing if it hasn't been brought to your attention, but if you are aware of it, so what do you do? How do you connect? How do you connect the people who are hurting to the resource they need so they can be free? Create a sanctuary of healing, as you said, safety.
Yeah. And you hit it right on the nose as well. Like there are some churches who are doing it great, who are doing it right, who are nailing it and have started to be that change. That is a very important call out right there. Is kudos to the churches that have been having these conversations. Mm-hmm. And that was our story. So the first church, like, of course, growing up, seeing that these churches were not embracing that and telling my mom to go back. Once she got free, thankfully, the church we went to, that is how she was able to get that correct theology. But they first loved on her soul. They first told her that it wasn't your fault. They had to honestly like reprogram and like get her out of all of that old thinking that it's not your fault, because she had so much like, God is going to judge me. I've filed for divorce. I've left my husband. And that was my model, the way they carried her. And again, we talked about how the children are witnessing this as well, because we're in the church, but we're not seeing it being modeled.
Right.
We're not seeing that being modeled when we go home. So for me to see how that church loved and cared for my mom's soul and ministered to her the truth, and it wasn't you all these years, that gave me hope. And that helped me to say, okay, like I want to come back to church, because I walked away. Like, I'll be quite honest. I walked away from church and I said, God, if you're so good, why did all this happen all these years? I remember praying for the abuse to stop. I remember, again, being on this journey with her, and being a preacher's kid, you're just like, no. But he had instilled so much fear in us about God that I still did the religious stuff. Like, all right, I'll still listen to gospel on Sundays, and I'll still pray over my food. I'll still pray over my tests, because I was early in college then. But that's all you got. At 7:00, I go back to doing me. And it was like the song Reckless Love. He kept chasing me down, and I was able to model and watch how they loved on my mother, and the correct theology and the transparency of even my pastor. And he told me early on, first meeting was like, I grew up in that. My wife grew up in that.
Yes.
So it was like, wait, what? And to hear the human aspect, and it goes back to the saying, people want to know that you care more than what you know. And for that, I didn't need to know any more word. I grew up in the church. I know the word, but I don't know how to fix this conflict. And that is when counseling came in. And that is when my counselor literally walked me 6 years through that journey of pairing healthiness and getting over that, to connect me to the humanity of man doesn't change the divinity of God, to that relationship aspect of The gifts and the calls are irrevocable. And I'm sorry. And it took my pastor to say, I'm sorry that you guys went through that. But exactly what you said. But in the Bible that I read, God never said that abuse was okay.
Right.
And it was those conversations and it was doing that work that helped me get to the point now of, it's still happening in 2020. So it's important we have these conversations.
Absolutely.
Because, and it's like so many people are like, well, you throw your dad under the bus. You say he's a preacher and what he's doing. I love my father.
Yeah.
That was a journey of healing and wholeness too, to even understand and apply grace and forgiveness, and that his sins are no better than the sins I make that I don't even want to make, right? So there's the components of I tell people that story because there's so many people who have left church for less, that if I can look at the offender of my house be the preacher by day and abuser by night and be in a real relationship with Christ, you can too. But it takes a little bit of time to also have those mental health conversations, to talk about it, to address those PTSDs, which is what I want to segment into now, is that a lot of people did think I was crazy for going to counseling. And especially my peers, Black people don't go to counseling. You're crazy if you go to counseling. So you got something else going on? No, I can't talk about what I feel. I didn't know the triggers. And honestly, it was through going through counseling that I learned that I was a childhood trauma and adverse childhood experience. It was an ACE, and that childhood domestic violence is a whole thing. And a lot of the roadblocks that I was hitting in my life was connected back to that dysfunction at home. And with that, so what do you give the conversation? Because you can't just pray it away. And so many people told me, pray it away. You just need to get in your word more. Well, some things don't come out unless it's by prayer and by fasting. So clearly you're not doing it right if it's still tripping you up. So can you talk to that point of, even there's some churches who still haven't embraced that mental health movement?
Yes. And before I touch that, I do want to tell you, I really appreciate you sharing on the story of how this church embraced you and was that door of healing for you. And there are churches who are talking about domestic violence, who are saying, I'm sorry for what you're experiencing. Let me hug you. I experienced this too, affirming your experience, that you're not crazy. This is a real thing, so that is so heartwarming to me, just to hear that was part of your experience. And that part of led to your healing, right? And healing that trauma, but it also speaks to the church hurt. On this past Sunday, I was listening to a message about domestic violence, and I have to shout out Dr. Bishop Rudolph McKissick, who was talking about domestic violence boldly and calling it out. And also I found in my research that the strategies of disconnection, one, that strategy survival was leaving the church, right? Became this church hurt. And what Bishop was talking about is that when we tell people to stay, we are really stripping them of their faith and dignity. And I thought it was so powerful because they are coming to this place for healing and support, but you're leading them back to stay into something and you're stripping them. So as a result, they leave, right? As a result, they leave, or they turn to drugs and alcohol, which some of my participants, they either left or turned to drugs and alcohol to cope with that deep pain. And so thank you so much for sharing just that warm, because there are churches who are doing the work, who are talking about it. In regards to the faith and mental health conference, they're doing that work as well. I shout out to one of my dear friends and sister in Christ, Dr. Anita Phillips. She is on tour and doing a lot. And what I have learned, it's prayer and faith. You can have Jesus and be saved, and something that she talks about a lot, prayer is a weapon, but therapy is your strategy, and so we have to utilize the tools that God gives us on earth. He heals us through therapy. He heals us through going to the doctor. He heals us through the medication, but we take that step in knowing that both work together for the good of our healing and well-being. We can do it both, and I think we have to continue the conversation, faith and mental health. We have to continue the conversation on domestic violence and mental health in the church. Why? Because it's so important. Because these are such taboo subjects in the church, for one, because they're looked down on. Did you experience domestic violence? Oh, well, there's a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of stigma attached to it. But when we can change and continue this conversation and continue that dialogue, we shift it. We have the power to shift this narrative that we can get healed through prayer, through therapy, because of our experience, or due to our childhood domestic violence, or due to whatever that may be, that there is help and healing that is possible. And you can get that through prayer, through faith, through a Christian counselor, through the church. There are bishops who have Christian counseling as ministries as part of this holistic approach and wellness. So I think doing what you're doing, talking about your story and continuing this dialogue of things that really tackle and play the Black community, we just have to keep doing it. Yeah. And normalizing it. And the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be a Christian and say that I've been struggling emotionally, or my mental health has been strained for the past time and I need some help with that. It's okay. We have to create this culture that I have you, as you said, I support you. I'm going to help you with this. I'm going to lead you to a counselor. Let's look for a counselor together. You're not alone.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. And so a couple weeks ago, my husband and I, we did a conversation, because we've been having these conversations at our church here. And we were talking about, so early in our marriage, there were new triggers that I didn't know were going to be triggered. And I didn't even I don't know what this is, but I know, can we go to counseling together to try to figure this out? And we did that within our first year of marriage. I pulled that one quickly. And again, there were some that were like, you guys got issues like that? No, like counseling is amazing. And it was through my counselor. I'm like, hey, let's go see our counselor. We can get one for our own later, but I want you to hear my counselor, because this is kind of the things we've been working out. And that was the first time my husband had embraced the counseling journey as well, because he had been taught too, like, Holy Spirit is your counselor. Holy Spirit is your guide. And for him, this is pretty practical. This is what, it's not that big, scary stigma that we have. This is actually very helpful, and it gives you the tools to apply later.
Right. And so you learn the tools in counseling, right? And I tell people with counseling, you do the work. I serve as a facilitator. I serve as a guide. I empower you. You may have some homework, but I empower you to make the decisions best for you, right? And so we work together, collaborative effort. But it's a beautiful thing. It can be sometimes, it can be, what's the word? Sometimes it's tough. Sometimes the counseling journey can be tough, but it's necessary work if you're thinking about your well-being and being whole. So that's awesome to hear that your husband was open. You have a supportive partner that believes in counseling the benefit of your marriage. And talking about some of those triggers that were coming up for you, that you may have thought that you may have, put that to the side, or maybe you have gotten to it, but they come back up, and that's how PTSD and trauma works with the brain, right? Sometimes you process it in counseling, and then you're in a new environment or in a new situation, and you're like, so why am I responding that way? So what's really happening for me? And it's a result of trauma. And sometimes we don't realize we have a trauma-based response.
Yeah.
Our responses are based on our trauma that we experience.
Yeah.
And it takes work. Childhood domestic violence, you're right, that is totally different from experiencing domestic violence in your teenage years, or because the earlier you are exposed to the violence, we have to think about the brain, right? And so when babies are born, these are very critical stages for them in attachment. So when they're crying, that's their way of responding and communicating. So when they're hearing the yelling or the fighting, their brain is also picking up on that as well. And then if the longer it becomes, it's left untreated, you begin to see this behavior, and parents say, I'm not really sure why they're acting that way, right? I'm not sure what's happening. And then, when we do assessments and try to figure out, well, there's been some sort of trauma that they have experienced, and now they're responding to the trauma.
That's also a good point to segue into as well, is because I started seeing it at 7. And so in seeing it at 7, you're going through this life cycle of kid, teenager, adult. And I remember, for me, you don't know how to articulate how you feel, even when I don't know what this is. No one's talking to me about it. It's just happening. I'm dealing with it. And for my mom, she left my dad 7 to 8 different times before finally saying, okay, I can't do this anymore.
Right.
And I remember during those,
kudos to hers. It takes 7 attempts, right? You know,
yeah,
it takes
yep,
7 attempts to successfully leave an abusive relationship.
yeah. And during those times we left, we ended up going to the church. So for me, it manifested in anger. I was very angry because as a child, like, you're ripped away from everything. You're on the run. You don't have your things. You're not in your room. These are the tangible things kids think about. I want my bed. I want my toys. I want my other siblings, by the way, because I was the youngest, and you don't have those. So I was very angry. So my mom's still going to faith community. They're embracing her. But for one of the things they told me, you're just angry. And I remember, and I have this in my book, where it was a Tuesday night and the women of the church laid hands on me to pray the demon out of me because I didn't want to talk. And I was so angry, and that's all they saw. So it's also a check to even youth leaders and even other ministry leaders that you may be seeing children. They may be acting out a certain way or isolated or withdrawn. There could be other signs that are the reason why they're doing that.
Yes, and speaking of youth leaders, in my training with faith community is that not only training your clergy, but training your youth leaders, training anybody who work with children, right, on how to report, how to recognize the signs, right? Just as you're saying, I had a youth leader one time say that the child said during Sunday school or children's church that they didn't want to go back home. They was like, so how do we respond to that? What do we say? It's important for all of your church who are working with children and working in your leaders to understand the signs of abuse and trauma, what's happening. If you are a mandated reporter, what do you do about that? Do you have to report? So it's really important, as you said, our youth leaders are trained, but also because of this abuse in the ages of 11 to 24, where it's the highest rate of teen dating violence, right? So we talked and touched on this relational template, right? At the earlier you experience it, it becomes your template. But between 11 and 24, it is so high, the rates for dating violence. It's because they don't know what a relationship looks like. So it's important for even your youth programs in your faith communities to have programs on teen dating violence, have programs on healthy relationships, talk about the tenets of healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships. And you will be surprised what you hear from youth and from adolescents and from teens when you begin to talk about healthy relationships.
Yeah.
Because said, now I know that I was raped by a family member. What do I do? I have a name for what I experienced. I thought they told me not to tell anybody. That's happening. Yeah.
What happens here stays here.
Absolutely.
It's continuing across generations.
Absolutely. We have to break that, we call it generational curse, but it's generational trauma.
Yes.
We have to break the generational trauma. We can start with going to counseling and getting that work done.
Yeah. And the teen dating violence, I feel, is starting much earlier is because a lot of these youth and a lot of these teens are seeing it at home. Mm-hmm. And for me, I started off in those relationships because I'm just seeking escape from what's happening at home. So let me talk to this guy because I'm trying to make this fairy tale of a song I'm listening to be my reality to escape what's happening here. But at the same time, I also attributed domestic violence to only physical. It is not just, it's more than a black eye. And with teens, with social media, with digital abuse, like there's so many components to it that we have to be aware to even teach them that this isn't normalized. I talked to a girl, 15 years old a couple months ago. She read my book and she was like, I thought this was how all black families were. Like abuse in all black families was the norm because all my friends are going through it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
No.
Absolutely.
No. And so if they think this is the norm, then this is what they go after. Mm-hmm. And this is what they are participating in. So it is education.
Education is the key. Education is the key. And there are these public and not public, but the cultural messages, social messages that about property, having to teach them, like you said, about cyberbullying, about power and control, having these conversations early on with your teens, even down, when someone says, oh, they hit me. Oh, but sometimes you hear the message, they just like you. No, we have to tell them, just because somebody hits you, that doesn't mean they like you, because you plant in your mind a form of hitting me, a form of some sort of treatment, abuse that could be like, oh, when I grow up, that just means he likes me, he loves me.
Yeah.
Because that's what mom and dad said when I was 5 years old, because this little boy hit me or this girl hit me. And that was okay. That just means they like me. We have to learn how to call it out very early on.
Yeah.
And teach them so they can have healthy relationships.
Yeah. Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for this conversation. How can those who are online, if they like to book you to equip their leaders and do trainings, can you provide some information? You're wearing a shirt, free, not broken. I'm waiting to receive mine, where they can also purchase theirs from.
Yeah, so thank you. You can follow me on social media under Dr. Shanita Brown on Facebook, Dr. Shanita Brown on Twitter, and also on Instagram. My website is www.shanitabrown.com, and you can go and purchase the Free Not Broken t-shirt. Free Not Broken is a movement that I started to bring awareness about domestic violence, and occasionally I donate the proceeds to an agency, especially in rural communities. I'm from a rural community. I grew up in a rural community. Rural communities are tremendously suffering with access to resources and things of that nature. So it's important to think about the smaller communities, and when you think about victims who are in small towns and being able to access resources. So yeah, so Free Not Broken, please make sure you get one. There are mugs there, there are tank tops. And so I'm really excited. Thank you for your support. We have to continue this conversation. Abuse is never okay. We have to tell this message: abuse is never okay. There are no circumstances where it isn't, oh, well, in this case, well, yeah, then that's okay to go through that. Oh, was they married? Well, then it'd be okay if they was married. No, if you find out about it, no, you don't deserve that. We need friends. We need a supportive network. If you know somebody that's been in a situation or in somebody, try to support them and know that it is very hard to get out of a controlling relationship. It is not that easy just to walk away. When a person decides to leave, they have to properly plan, connect them to an agency, connect them to an advocate so they can do safety planning, but also emotional safety planning for their emotional well-being. It is very dangerous when they begin to try to regain their power back. The controller tactics begin to increase. And that's the time when perpetrators and abusers tend to kill people when they figure out you're trying to leave.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Sadly so, because there is a young lady that I've been talking to I'm originally from Michigan. Her mother was killed. She was just actually featured on the Tamron Hall show. Her mother beat breast cancer. She beat COVID, and she was tired of this relationship and she wanted to leave. She was trying to leave, and he saw it, he noticed it, and he killed her.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that is the most dangerous time to leave.
It's a dangerous time to leave. It isn't something, I just hope that people walk away with being more empathetic towards people who are in an abusive relationship. Nobody gets into a relationship to be abused. I've heard so many times, well, they're just in it, she could just walk away. It isn't that simple when you understand the mind or a person who is so controlling and that would do whatever they can to maintain that power and control. Literally, as Tiffany said, do whatever they can. You hear, if I can't have her, that other person can't have her. If you want to leave me, you're not going to leave me. So we're going to both die together. You hear the murder suicides and things of that nature. And it's really sad. But there is hope. There is hope available. There's hope is possible, as what you're talking about, and Tiffany. There are faith communities who are doing the work. But we know there's a lot more work to be done. Yeah. You need a movement.
Definitely a movement. I was having an interview last week, and I said, domestic violence was a global pandemic before COVID happened. It's just now the light is shown a little bit brighter to what folks have been trying to turn a blind eye to. When we come out of this, we're already still in it, where the concerns are mounting, but coming out of this, there are going to be survivors. There are going to be victims that are going to be coming to our churches, that are going to be
Yeah.
coming to our leaders who are going to be needing help. And now it's the time to equip up, get educated,
Yes.
and get these things in place so
Yes.
that they can have these safe havens to come to. We can embrace them.
Yes, contact me to make sure your sanctuary is a safe place, even online, because we know that victims are trapped right now. And so, as faith leaders and your ministers, if you have not thought about that, begin looking at how are we helping? What are we getting? How are we helping people in our church who may be in this situation? What information are we passing out? What are we doing? There's a lot of talk about mental health as in this next pandemic. Well, for me, it's already a pandemic. I do this work. So we got to look at mental illness, to look at domestic violence. We got to look at things from a holistic perspective. What haven't we touched on?
Yeah.
Offering the crisis line, but are we offering domestic violence hotline? How are we trying to connect our people with resources? So it's this work and this conversation to continue with.
Yes. And I thank you so much. I thank you for those that logged in and connected. Definitely have the replay available up on YouTube and share that out as well within the next 24 hours. So look forward to keeping in touch with you and having more of these conversations.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. You all stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe.
All right, bye.
All right, bye-bye.